doing another little different experiment, 2 experiments. One of them is that we have a court reporter here stenographically transcribing all of these presentations. If you want a typewritten presentation afterwards, she can mail them to you. Her name is Janice Russell. Stand up if you would, Janice. She's from Madison, Tennessee, and she's here to stenographically report this conference. So you will be able to get either tapes, video, or audio tapes, or a written, and we're going to try a transcription, a typewritten transcription. We're trying that to see how it works. This is an experiment with us, but this will be a verbatim transcription of our presenters. Now we need to have it quieted down, please, to give the courtesy that the presenters deserve. Tonight you want to be here at 6:45 because then you're going to hear a rapid-fire bunch of presentations, incidentally. And then if you got a friend who likes a little humor, you want to be here also tonight, or bring them here. Are we ready on the camera? We have now a triple header presentation which will run for 2 hours. 3 people who have a story to tell you that all of you might experience somewhat of a stretch to comprehend it and believe it. Incidentally, is there more air conditioning that can be turned on? Are you a little warm out there? Can we crank it up a little bit? I know I forgot something. Robin Quail brought to us at Tampa a panel of herself and 4 other people, and we asked them to squeeze their presentation into an hour, which of course was very difficult, but they did an admirable job. But now we have cut that down to 3 of them in 2 hours, and they each have an awful lot to tell you. So we're indebted to Robin Quail to bringing us John Leith, herself, of course, and John Leith and Phil Sparks, and she'll bring on John after she finishes her little story of a few things that I think you'll find very interesting. Welcome, Robin Quail of Atlanta, Georgia, this afternoon. Maybe I'll try it.
Okay,
That holds a little better. Is that okay?
Thanks. Okay, well, I don't need that, do I?
Oh, you got the other one.
Well, I'm happy to be back here. I spoke here in '93 and then last year in Tampa, so I really feel like now I'm a real part of the Global Sciences family, and it feels good too. I'll just give you a thumbnail of my background if you don't know who I am. I've had over 25 years in being a regression hypnotherapist. I'm a certified hypnotherapist. I've done over 30,000 regressions. Started out doing past life regressions, and then the UFO abduction things started creeping in, and this is back in about '72. If you can think back that long, you didn't hear very much about the abduction stuff back then, and there was no literature to back up anything. There were no guidelines, there were no guidebooks, there was nothing to tell you if you were a therapist how to handle this. There was nothing to even tell you what this was. There was a lot of stuff about UFOs, but very little about abduction. The Betty and Barney Hill thing was about the only thing I'd ever read. Anyway, I consider myself sort of a pioneer in this field because now I've worked with hundreds and hundreds of people who've had abduction experiences, who've had contactee experiences, what I call the prodigy experience, vanishing twins, and many other levels of it. I've also done paranormal counseling for these 25 years. I'm also have had practitioner training in New Thought spiritual healing systems, 3 different systems, even before I started being a hypnotherapist. So that gave me a lot of help in trying to work spiritually with people who were having a lot of bizarre things happen to them. And believe me, I have had the gamut. And in Atlanta, where I live, anytime anybody has anything weird, if they have a ghost, a poltergeist, a UFO, whatever, they say, send them to Robin. And so I've been around the block with this sort of thing. With all the abduction stories in the beginning, I'll tell you that at first I thought, they must be out of body. They must be sort of a paranormal experience. They must be astral traveling or dreaming. They can't be taking these people out of their beds in the middle of the night, taking their babies, implanting them, injecting them, doing all sorts of painful and unusual procedures to them. And I had seen a UFO in the daytime with a large group of people at quite close range back in 1969, and a number of other people had seen it in nearby locations, and someone finally saw it on the road late that night. So I was not a stranger to this kind of experience, but in 1979 I had sort of a wake-up call or an eye-opener. And I was working with a very unusual man who claimed to have a lot of UFO experiences, which frankly, even though I believed a lot of the people who came to me, most of them I did, I was very skeptical of his because they were so bizarre. They were the most bizarre I've even yet ever heard of. And but he could do some very unusual things also, because when I put him in past life regressions, he could speak in whatever the language that the lifetime was in whatever period. Ancient Egyptian. He could also write any of the languages while he was in trance that were involved. So he could write the beautiful hieroglyphics and speak the fluent Egyptian and many other things. He told me these bizarre stories all the time, and I just didn't believe him. But one night he was very, very ill with a very dangerously high fever. He had infectious hepatitis. He asked me to put him in trance. He got up in the middle of the trance and walked out my front door, which made me highly nervous because he was in trance, and he was known to fall very hard in trance. He walked around a lot in trance. So another friend who was visiting also went out with us. I always had someone walk behind him when he was in trance. And I was not expecting what was out there, but out in my front yard there was a UFO hovering over my house at a very low level. I don't know exactly to tell you how many feet, but maybe 100 to 200 feet above the tall poplar tree that was in my front yard. It was a huge glowing disc, and this man stood out there like this, which irritated me no end, and I cannot tell you why, but it just seemed like such a corny thing to do when there's such a momentous event happening in your front yard and someone stands out there like this. And I was only thinking, how could I get him back safely inside on a couch where I knew he wouldn't fall, where I didn't have to be distracted by him, where I could come back out and figure out what this thing was doing over my house. So in a little while, he answered that for me, because he turned around and went back inside, and we had to follow him in. And when I came back out, of course, it was gone. But I'll tell you, of course, he was perfectly healed. He was perfectly well. And after some thought, I realized that that UFO was there because of him and because of me. And it must have been one of the benevolent species, of which I do not believe all of them are. I speak at UFO conferences all over the country and in other countries. I've done documentaries and been on major television shows in Russia, Finland, Germany, France, Mexico, Canada, everywhere. But I just couldn't figure out what this was. But I realized that it had something to do with me. And I realized that there are many, many different species. And all over the world where I speak, in different places, and especially at secular or conferences that are not specifically UFO conferences. At UFO conferences, they always want to know the strangest, the highest strange stuff, the most far out, the most weird experiences I've had, because they're jaded. They've heard it all over and over and over. And the abduction stuff that some people think is so bizarre, is so old hat to them, they don't want to even hear that anymore. But at other conferences I go that are more just spiritually based, they want to hear the positive stuff. And so I wrote the book called Prodigies. I don't have any books here with me because I just got back from France and I didn't have time to get any more printed before I came to this, but it's about a positive area, and if anyone wants a book, I can send them one. But it's about genius inventors who were contacted when they were young children by a benevolent human-looking species, and often had their IQs beefed up quite a bit, sometimes double, and then as they got older they were channeling 21st century kind of technology, the kind of technology that would change our world, that would destroy all the polluting, all the destruction that the technology, the combustion engine, for instance, and everything. There were technologies. I've now had a number of conferences. I worked with Carol Dennis on some of this. We did research on this together in the beginning, and also on the vanishing twins. And the vanishing twins is something that a number of people have now addressed at this at Global Sciences conferences, and it's an aspect of the prodigies where one twin disappears in utero, and one of my abduction cases brought me a medical textbook article, and she worked in a delivery room, and what it said was 71% of women who have had sonographic proof that they have twin baby fetuses in their body, 71% of those women only have one baby. And I, went to Emory, to the medical school, to the library, and researched that, all the literature on twins, and it backed that up totally. So I thought, well, I wonder if this has anything to do with all these fetus retrievals, because most of the abduction cases of younger women involve a fetus retrieval. The woman turns up pregnant. Very often the woman is not having sex. There are lesbians who come to me and tell me that they have not had sex and have tested and found themselves pregnant with several tests. Because if you were not having sex and you found yourself pregnant, I think you'd want to verify that several times, and they did. And then things happen, the fetuses are taken. Sometimes they have only a dim memory or part of the memory of what happened, and that's why they come to get a regression to fill in the pieces. Abduction cases the people often have what happened in the very beginning when they first saw something in their room, a strange light, a being, or maybe they were in their car and the car died and there was a light. And then they'll have the end of the memory when 2 hours have passed and they're back in their car, or back in their bed with their nightgown on backwards or wrong side out, or buttoned up all crazy. So regression is very helpful, not only to fill in the memory, but to remove the fear and the agony. Many of these people, it's just destroyed their whole lives, and if that wasn't enough, then the abductees who talk about their experiences often get government harassment. And I've got quite a lot of cases. I'm going to talk more about the harassment in my workshop, but it involves some there's no doubt that they were being harassed, but this is happening. One girl, I did some regressions up in Annapolis a while back, and on the way home from the person's house that I was doing this work at, on the way home from her regression, a black helicopter is buzzing her all the way home, and when she gets home, it's over her deck, and she's calling us saying they're out there now. And they're just things like this that happened all the time. I personally have not had any harassment that I know of, except a borderline thing. I was on a radio show for 3 hours one night talking about, well, I was with two other women who do UFO research. One is a crop circle researcher, and one is another lady who speaks around the country and does some research. Neither one of them are abductees, though, I don't think. But anyway, we were all three on the show for 3 hours, and people called in. And one person who called in, I asked to call back, actually two, I asked to call back in later. And both of them spoke very briefly on the phone, did not give their names, and yet after talking to one of these people for a bit on the telephone and doing a regression with him later, he was called in for an interview by a military intelligence major in his National Guard headquarters. The man did not have a name tag on, and he did not know the man. And on the major's desk was this 3-hour radio show, a transcript of the 3-hour radio show. And I don't know, I know that costs a lot of money to have 3 hours worth of legal stuff or anything transcribed. So I thought it was very interesting that they had done that. Do they transcribe all radio shows? Do they tape all radio shows about this? And how did they know this young man was the one who called him? He asked, how did you know it was me? Because I didn't give my name. Oh, someone recognized your voice. I don't think that was the case, but I don't know. Anyway, another young man that I've been working with that's had abduction stuff all his life has had a change in his abduction experiences in the last 2 years. His abductions are, he can almost time them. They're usually Sundays and Tuesdays, but they're very regular. He spoke at the conference last January in Tampa. He was on our panel. But 2 years ago, he said that the experience changed, and suddenly, when he would get on the ships with the aliens, and he remembers a great deal of this, he does get regular regressions to fill in, but he stays quite alert on the ship, even though he says there are always quite a lot of other humans on the ship waiting their turn at whatever they're doing to them, medical procedures. That the other people are sort of like this, in a trance. Even if their eyes are open, they're glazed over and they're not looking around. But he's always aware enough and looking around. So he noticed, and he said, this disturbs me more than anything ever has in this whole lifetime of abduction, is that now there are military people on the ship with the gray aliens. And they're military, with their computers, human-looking, computers and desks and all sorts of things have often been added. And he said the military people are drinking coffee out of styrofoam cups, and he hears them chatting over to the side, because he says sometimes they don't realize that he's aware and can hear them. And he told about a large black woman that was frequently on the trip, on the ship, with a hospital type, hairnet and gown, and she always gave him the shots that he got. So on one occasion, not too long ago, he was awakened as usual and taken out the door by the aliens, and when he got outside his door, there were two military people with rifles standing outside his door, and there was a helicopter overhead. Now this he'd never seen before. He was beamed right into the helicopter, exactly as he's beamed into the ship. He said they just always pulled his arm or pulled his leg or pulled some part of his body into the beam, and the instant there was that contact, he was just drawn right up in the beam. And this is what happened with the helicopter. He was taken up into this helicopter, and there were military personnel on that, and he was taken to a nearby base. He believes that it was Dobbins Air Force Base in Atlanta, Georgia, which is near where he lives, but he's not I can't be sure of that. When he got there, a young doctor was roused out of his sleep about 3 or 4 in the morning, as it was, and brought in to examine him. This doctor was clearly quite angry at being awakened in the middle of the night. His hair was not combed, his clothes were not properly buttoned or completely, you know, tucked in and all. And he was quite angry and wanted to know why this man had been brought there. And he examined him and said, "He's fine. Why did you bring him here? Take him back." Well, he said he thinks that the people that got him that night didn't realize that he was one who stayed awake and alert and was looking around, and they were concerned about that. He has many other experiences that I'll elaborate on later in the workshop or whatever, but this is typical. I've got a lot of this government-based stuff involved with abduction stuff. There's one young woman who, again, she said that she was, considered herself a lesbian, was not having sex, and yet found herself pregnant. Was quite worried about, afraid to even take a drink with her friends because she didn't know what was happening. So she worked on a base, a military base. She was in the Army, in the West, in Colorado. She worked in a hospital, she worked in a blood lab and in a morgue. She remembered some parts of what happened, and she had joined a meditation class that I taught. And every time we went into meditation, she would get very upset and perspire and shake and say she saw what she thought was an underground concrete room with a light bulb hanging over her and a table, and that something very bad happened in that room. So we regressed her. And what happened in the regression was that we began with what she remembered. The last thing she had remembered was that the lab director had insisted she give blood. She worked in the blood lab, but she said, "I'm too thin. If you're too thin, you're not supposed to give blood," and other things. She didn't want to do it, and she resisted, but they absolutely insisted. So I put her in the regression, and we return her to that time. So she says she's lying on the gurney, and she says they're putting this needle in right here, and she's kind of sort of groggy, and she says, "Oh, you don't take blood there." And then she says, "Oh my God, they're drugging me." So then she's on an elevator, she's going deep underground. She's in a room very deep underground. The military hospital personnel are all standing against the wall with their hands behind them. And she is surrounded on this table that she's lying on, or gurney, by a group of gray aliens who are working on her. And they are taking a fetus out of her, this woman who has had no sex. Then she's in another room. She believes that it was a different room, but we're not quite sure because she thought she was on a different table. But there's a light hanging right down in her face, and there's this same discordant noise that she heard in the meditation group when she was having the flashbacks. And she's quite frightened because there's a human man now leaning right over her in her face, screaming in her face that she's going to die. And this very loud noise and this very bright light. Well, these are standard, old type standard mind control techniques, actually. So then she's back up on the ground floor, and she's suddenly walking around the base, just strolling around the base with an officer on the base that she did not know, but a superior officer, and he's just being very agreeable and chatting with her and very solicitous, saying, "Are you sure you're all right? You sure everything's okay?" And just strolling and chatting for quite a while. And so, we assumed that perhaps he wanted to see if she was okay, she wasn't going to pass out, she wasn't going to hemorrhage, she wasn't going to remember what happened, and so on. So in the workshop, I'm going to talk quite a bit about her case, because there were a lot of other very strange things that happened in the blood lab, that happened in the morgue. There were strange deaths, there were strange fetuses that were brought in there, quite unusual looking. And She's quite frightened even today, even though that's been several years now, and she's been out of the Army for quite a while. She's still quite disturbed about that. She still has abduction scenes that pop into her every night almost. Okay, I'm going to throw in another case that you may have heard about. I'm the person who did the work on this case, but some other people I understand are now talking about it. I had two clients who had had abduction experiences who were working at a very large telecommunications firm in Atlanta. It's outside Atlanta. It's in a very suburban area, and it's sort of an isolated building. And one afternoon between 3 and 5 o'clock, there were some very strange occurrences there. This man, who was an executive, passed the lady, who's also an executive, who was also my client. Both of them had had abduction experiences and regressions. He passed her and spoke to her, and she didn't answer. He said she just seemed trance-like and glazed. So he went into his little office and turned on his computer. And he said it, then he got really woozy, and then he was afraid he was going to pass out. And then he was coming out of it, and he was still groggy, and his computer was off. He couldn't turn on the monitor. The power was off. The phone was dead. And he looks at his watch, and 2 hours had gone by. This is about from 3 to 5. So he goes out into the hallway, and everybody's coming out of all the offices, looking at their watches. They're all dazed, they're all glazed over, they're all groggy, they're all saying, what is going on, what has happened? And everybody was confused, and there was just total mass confusion. There had been a supposed shift change at 3:30, and this is a very highly secured building. You have to put a card in to get in or out. So the people who were supposed to come to work at 3:30 were still in their cars in the parking lot at 5. People that were supposed to leave at 3:30 were still in the building at 5. There was a man in the lead line room, and this is a building secured against nuclear attack, had been trapped in there because the electronic doors wouldn't open. He said that everything started arcing in there, and then the lights went out, and only a red battery light came on. He has had UFO experiences, I found out since then, before this happened. There were large burned circles on the grass around the building. In the workshop, I've got some sketches that this man who worked there actually made, showing the shape of the building and where the workshop was, and showing what the aliens look like and the route and so forth that they took. So these circles, they replanted the grass because it was dead. So they put new sod down. They did this 4 times, and they finally had to take up 8 inches of dirt and put new dirt. And it began to grow after the 5th time when they put the new dirt in. But a year later, you know, it was still a really weird yellowish color. And you could still see the pattern of the circles a year later. The security guards said that there were cameras on the outside of the building that were battery operated. The security guards said that spaceships had landed, people were frozen in their cars in the parking lot, and that aliens were taking people out of the building. Well, this is what people have regressed have said, that they were taken out of the building by the aliens. A large section of the cable, the power cable coming into the building, was completely melted. This was a system that had 2 backup systems, a battery system and a diesel system. The battery system melted, and the diesel system failed. So this is a case that, you know, we're still working on, still finding all the people. And they closed this whole plant down not long after they announced the closing, right after this, and started moving the people out. They sent them to Tampa, they sent them all over. And they really resisted any internal investigation of this. But okay, I don't have a lot more time, but I'm going to tell you about we hear a lot about people believing that they're going to be picked up by UFOs. And I was recently a guest on CNN after that mass suicide with the people who thought that they were going to be picked up by Hellbot, or by the so-called companion. So there's a lot of talk about that everywhere, that we're going to have mass landings and they're going to save us and take us off the planet and everything. Now this is an interesting case. I don't know if it means something like that. I'll let you be the judge, but I'll just tell you. I'll tell you that this story is from a completely reliable person whom I have implicit faith and trust in. Okay. This man, who was about in his early 40s, and his girlfriend and 3 other couples were riding what they call three-wheelers out in the desert near San Diego. This is a couple of years ago. They went into a large canyon that has white sand in it and almost hit someone when they went into it. And they saw that there were these long lines of people in the canyon moving slowly along in a trance-like state. There were little children in pajamas. There were women in house dresses and aprons. There were men in business suits. There was a man in full ski outfit. There was every kind of dress. Like these people had just suddenly been plucked from whatever they were doing and put there. The little children were not with their families. They were not families, and these were individuals. And there were 4 lines of these people. Very, very long line. He estimated the lines to be almost a quarter of a mile long. They kept calling to these people and yelling at them, and went right up to them, and no one would answer. What are y'all doing? What's going on? What is this? Finally, they went around to the back of the line, and his girlfriend, with her chutzpah, said, "Hey, you." And there were 2 redneck cowboys standing at the very back of the line, and between them was this tall man with blonde hair and very clear blue eyes, in sort of a different kind of an outfit, some sort of close-fitting white or cream-colored suit, not a business suit. And so she started yelling at him, "What is going on?" No one paid any attention to her, and she said, "Hey, you, I mean you, what is going on?" And she was screaming this at him. Finally, she screamed an expletive at him, and he whirled around then. And my friend said that he looked in his eyes, and that when she locked eyes with me, he said, all the energy drained out of me, and I felt totally paralyzed. And I felt like if we had not left when we did, that the next thing that we would have been in that line. But he said that his girlfriend got really frightened, and she screamed, "Stop that, you SOB, right now." And so that sort of broke the energy, and they all drove away, quite disturbed and frightened and shaken by this. And so this was almost like an all-night ride until they got where they were going. And when they got there, he said he gassed up. Nobody else would go back. He'd been begging them to go back. They wouldn't go back. So he and his girlfriend went all the way back. It was about dawn when they got back. The people were gone. But the footprints were all there. And the footprints just came to a sudden stop. There were no tracks. There were no footprints beyond that point, just the footprints suddenly stopped. So, you can think on that a while and see what you think that means. Were those people being picked up by a UFO? I've had a couple of other similar stories, but not quite as strange or bizarre. One of them involved some people coming up out of sort of a tunnel or cave with all their belongings, and a UFO waiting right on the water there. But this one I know is from a very, very reliable source that I know. And so that's why I feel very good about it being true. There's so many other aspects that we can talk about later. The implants, I've had some very definite positive implants that have been verified. I want to talk also about Rennes-le-Château, the place in France that was written about in Holy Blood, Holy Grail, because that's definitely a UFO place. Bucharest that Mary talked about, and how all this fits together. I'm working on a project in France and I've been doing quite a lot of research over there. I've also done quite a lot of research on Bigfoot, and I have a lot of information about that to give. I want to introduce John Leith, who's going to be the next person on the panel. I met John a few years ago in Florida when I was doing a workshop, and he lent me a very unusual manuscript that he's been working on that absolutely blew my mind. I stayed up all night to read it, and so he has been a journalist, and he has had some very unusual and wonderful sources of information. So I want to turn over the podium to John. Let's see.
Can you hear me? That's better. Unfortunately, I can hear myself. I've been around a long time. I don't know anything supernatural about me, but I sure have had a lot of supernatural things happen. I didn't come here today to talk to you about them, but at the last minute I'm almost disposed to mention 2 or 3. I'm alive today, except that peculiar things happened to save my life 7 times when I should have been dead, the last 2 times this summer. And I'm pleased to wake up every time to face a new day and be quite happy. I think the most momentous thing that happened to me when I was declared dead and the last rites were given, I was lying in a hospital with a private nurse, and they were going to put the sheet over me. And a beautiful lady came in the room, sat beside the bed, and took my wrists in her hands, and all my pain and trouble went away. And I became really alive. They carried her out of the room and lay her down because she was covered with wrinkles and pain had made her exhausted. I don't know what happened after that, but that was a beautiful experience. I went to university at Carleton in Ottawa, Canada. I thought that was the greatest profession. And I ran papers for several years, and I also put out a newspaperman's newspaper from Toronto, and they're a critical bunch, believe me, when they want to read about themselves. A lot of ego in journalists. I'll tell you that. I retired to Florida, at least I thought I did. And I rather think that the 7 times I was saved from imminent death in the war and after the war and even this summer, I think it was because I had to tell this story. Let me digress for a moment. I'm going to talk about a hero, by the way. He's a hero as great as the Wright brothers, Lindbergh, any historian you want to talk about, Drake, Raleigh, Cabot. He's probably the world's greatest man. He's been dead a few years, but I met him. Through him and other sources, I came across the greatest story of my life. It paled everything I had written. And I had done a lot of research in various subjects, And I thought there was nothing new under the sun until I met this man and other people in the security forces of the United States who told me these things that I found unbelievable. So I'll digress for a moment. We live in the Milky Way. They say there are 9 planets, but I hear there are 12. I hear that from aliens, and I've met quite a few aliens in my day from other planets. Our sun is in a galaxy called the Milky Way. We all know about that. It's about 300 light years across and 50 light years deep. We have neighbors such as the Pole Star, Sirius, etc. And you get out to the Pleiades, they're there with about 25 or 29 suns. We're pretty small in our little isolation here in this solar system. Well, I read a book recently and talked to a man who was a scientist and an astronomer. He said, it's generally agreed today by astronomers and scientists that the universe is unending. Well, I said, Jeremiah said that 3,000 years ago. He said the host of heaven can't be numbered. And Newton said about the same thing. He said, I don't know where infinity begins and where it ends. And you know what happened to Galileo when he said the sun went around the earth, what they did to him? He had to renounce everything he said and said, no, no. The earth, he had to reverse his decision that the sun didn't go around the earth, that the earth was traveling all the time at 5.5 miles a second, at 12.5, and the sun was traveling at 5.5. But he had to reverse it all. Then in 1926, Galileo came with a telescope that he could see the heavens. And we were confounded by the number of galaxies in this cosmos. They estimated 1 trillion galaxies, and they still do. 1 trillion? And they said every galaxy has at least 100 billion star systems. We're a very small one here. Now, folks, if you want to multiply 1 trillion by 100 billion, you know how many possible planets there are in the universe? Many years ago, I saw a 2-page picture in Life or one of the magazines, and it showed what we could see of the universe. The whole 2 pages. It told where we were. You couldn't find our Milky Way, let alone our world. And you know, there's a bunch of creatures around. There may be a couple here today, not really invited. But they tell us we're the only intelligent place in the whole cosmos. Oh, my. They must think we're all out of a retarded school. And they pay the debunkers to come and tell us this. They put them on the radio, on the TV, and they get big money for it, probably $60,000, $70,000, $100,000 a year. And we have to do everything for nothing. We're idealists, all of us here. I think we are special creatures, as Mary said and Robin said. I think we're unusual. Back in 1936, I will tell you 2 little stories. All the time aliens are arriving here by spaceship. Are some of you aware of that? They arrive constantly. They arrive almost every day. They circle our Earth. They watch us. They stare down our chimneys. Where do they come from? Some are good. Some are bad. And some are just observing and mapping the Earth. That's what they're doing. This little planet in this little solar system is being observed by people from light years away right now. 1936. Up in Massachusetts, a strange round-shaped spacecraft landed for the third time, and out of it came creatures who were more looking like octopus than a human being. But they were super intelligent. We fired on them. They get out of back in their craft and went away. They slithered back in. Beside them were these monsters Robin was talking about. By the way, I've seen those Yeti. Remember that incident for a moment, because the witnesses went up and told President Roosevelt and frightened the whole cabinet at that time in the White House. The same year, another alien arrived. He went into the White House and the guards could not stop him. They shot him, in fact. The bullets went right through him. And he walked through the door and appeared before President Roosevelt, as they have done dozens of times since then, and we don't know anything about it. Mr. Roosevelt called his cabinet immediately and wondered what to do, and they drew up a committee of 100 to decide how to tell the people about the strange aliens, the evil, sinister, horrible-looking creatures, and this beautiful alien who was so human in his looks, but he could walk through a door. He spent over 2 hours, the handsome alien in the spacesuit, spent over 2 hours with President Roosevelt. And you know, friends, the president was never the same again afterwards, period. So he called a meeting and he told the people, there's something we don't know. We have 3 laws. We have length, width, height to determine what's happening in the world. Einstein would use a fourth. He would talk about space and admit that there had to be time to figure out the dimensions. But the aliens proved to Mr. Roosevelt that there are probably 19 or 20 natural laws which we humans don't know about. They came here. How did they get here so quickly? At any rate, they decided to tell the people they would do it through a radio drama. Anybody hear Orson Welles back in the 30s? Well, he's been repeated a few times, those who don't want to admit their age. That was first tried out, the War of the Worlds, at the White House. The legislators told him, make it worse, make it more frightening. And so they put on the radio drama of 1 hour without any breaks whatsoever in the dialogue or the narrative, and 8 people jumped out of windows, roads were blocked in New Jersey, life was not the same, and dear friends, that was the beginning of the cover-up that lasts to today about the aliens coming onto this earth. I've met some of the aliens, but they come in all shapes and sizes. They come in round craft, egg-shaped craft, football-like craft, pencil-like crafts. The most ominous one is cigar-shaped craft, round-shaped craft, and we've even had 2 occasions of square craft, one in the northern dew line of Canada and one down in the southern states. The people who look like us are allowed to land and taken to Walter Reed Hospital. If they want to stay, they can, and if they're not welcome, they're made to go away immediately. And this is happening all over the world. Friends, we are not alone anymore. The beginning of this coming century tells me and others who here know the same things that I do, a new world is about to be born in which we are no longer alone in the universe. Are they Machiavellian creatures? Are they good? Are they bad? Is the world about to be taken over? Or are they looking at this world which is about to destroy itself with atomic bombs? Well, I think that may be the answer, frankly speaking. I have no idea how they can stop a coming war of nuclear proportions on this planet Earth. But isn't it surprising that during the war, all the major cities, Tokyo, Berlin, Moscow, Washington, were flown over by strange alien craft almost every day. And in 1978, 7,000 craft were observed in our skies from other places. Mr. Roosevelt said after the meeting, telling about these situations, what are we going to do? Everybody fan out, get to the universities, get to the industrial people, see if you can find two things. Is there a force that we don't know about beyond petrol and gasoline and rockets even? Is there a force that can make a craft travel through space fast without gasoline, without their petrochemical fuels? And finally, find out if there is an American alive who is toying with such an outer space craft that we don't know about. There was a man called Harry Lee Cohn from Florida, and he'd heard of a man called, well, I'll hold his name off for a minute. He'd heard about a maverick flyer who had flown in World War I and been shot down, and was at Kelly Field each year to do revised training, who flew into the Central America looking for oil. He did a barnstorm, taking people up in his twin wing craft, bi-wing. They found that man. That man had begun in 1921 to develop a round-wing plane. I wish I had a saucer here instead of a cup, because it looked like a saucer. Have you heard of the Frisbees? At Kelly Field, he used to throw the plates around and even the hats, and he decided that the fixed-wing plane was taboo, that life would have to develop a new plane, and it would have to be one leading edge, and it would have to be round. And if he could balance it in the center so that there would be nothing wrong and make it ride on a cushion of air itself with a motor, then he would have a conveyance that couldn't crash. Fixed-wing plane will always crash when the motor's gone. Harry Lee Cohn found that man, and he got to his place. He got to the White House and he said, would you send somebody out to look at this craft? And they sent a colonel out by the name of Watkins, Peter Watkins. He went out to Glen Burnie, Maryland. By the way, this man had developed the craft in this city we're in Denver, Colorado. He first developed a 12-inch, then a 12-footer, right here at the Locomotive Works of Rio Grande. That's where he had proved that a round-wing plane could go high, lift anything, and without falling or tumbling to earth. So the colonel went out to Glen Burnie, Maryland, where this man was, and he found his name was, this is not his right name. His name was Jonathan E. Caldwell. He said, I'd like a ride in your plane and I'll give you $10. Caldwell says, they call it the flying bathtub. Do you want to get in it? He said, sure, I want to ride in it. Caldwell didn't know who he was because he was in civvies. Well, we took him up in the flying bathtub. It had counterclockwise propellers, 6 of them on the top and 6 on the bottom, which were fixed. I don't mean fixed. I mean the props were fixed at a certain slant. That meant it could develop a retrograde action and hover in the air. So the colonel drove the craft with Caldwell to Washington and flew over the monument, and he said to Caldwell, make this craft stop in front of the 241 foot high monument. Caldwell says, no problem. Well, I don't know whether he used those words or not, but he might have heard the Cosby Show, no problem. Anyway, the colonel was amazed because the craft hovered and didn't move. People laughed from the ground at the flying bathtub, but when he went over the White House, he didn't. And when he went over the Japanese and German embassy, they didn't laugh. They took pictures. And then they took the craft back, and he said, make it go forward. A round-wing plane can't go forward. It went forward. He tilted the top propellers. And he went backwards and sideways, and he shut off the motor. And the colonel thought he would die. Actually, the craft, the round-wing craft, floated to the air, through the air to the ground, and landed on water without sinking. Friends, I forgot to tell you this, and I'm sorry. The model that the colonel rode in was not 12 feet. It was 28 feet, the last model that Caldwell had ever built. Now, any aerodynamics man knows that a craft that will do that, as crude as this was, that it's the perfect craft if it had speed. It would only go 100 miles an hour. He went back to the White House. He got in touch with President Roosevelt and the Army Air Corps head, whose name I've forgotten. He said, I've just had the most unusual, unbelievable ride in a lighter-than-air machine, and I've got to tell you about it. Here's what happened. Caldwell disappeared in 1937 and was never seen again. The tobacco warehouse where he'd done his work was forgotten. He moved away with his wife and son and daughter. There's so much human interest here, I have to skip it all, but there's a lot of it. A lot of it. In 49, now I said in 37 he disappeared. In 49, they found the remains of that craft in the old barn as some kids ran in and found the first round-wing plane in that barn. The Air Force came and took it away with red faces and never said a word about it. But the Boston Globe and the another paper up there told the story, and it's still there today to be told. Baltimore Sun. I got the pictures, but the government took them as well as 100 other pictures I have. They confiscated them all and did something that was not nice to the messenger who was bringing them to me. I'll have to go quickly through this. I don't know how much time I have left, but Caldwell then was taken from Glen Burnie to Dayton, and hangar number 2, they developed the first round-wing plane. The old ugly bathtub thing became a sleek ship, and he flew it over the White House in 1938, and it went at 700 miles an hour. Well, what was it? I've forgotten the other airplane we had at about that time. It went about 300 miles an hour, our best fighter aircraft, and that was a top speed. And this craft went at 700. It was shaped more like a saucer than a bathtub. Roosevelt came out and looked at it and was so happy. Unfortunately, excuse me, one night while Caldwell was having great problems and he couldn't overcome them, something happened to him that had happened previously. His police dog stood up and wagged its tail, and through the door there came an alien without opening the door. He said, on your desk there, I see you're trying to work out a petrochemical formula. I'll tell you what your problem is, and also I'll tell you what your carburation problem is, and then you can cover it up again. They talked for quite a while, and the dog did not bite him, did not growl. That man was to appear again twice to Caldwell to help him with the final design of the round-wing plane, which America and Canada and Britain spent all their wartime years there and before and after building. I don't know what to leave out and what to put in. So many wonderful things happened. But one day, In 1941, a craft came out of the sky in the hidden valley in the northwest where they were now being built. They moved the manufacturing from Dayton, Ohio to Los Alamos to a hidden valley in the northwest. And in that valley where the final product was being built in 1941, a craft came out of the sky and a stranger stepped out with a 5-pound package under his arm and he said, "I want to see Mr. Caldwell." He said, "We've watched you for a long time." I don't know whether I should tell you people what planet it is because you might walk out on me. But it was a planet from our solar system. He said, "We've watched you for a long time and we think now it's time that you had the anti-gravity motor and forget about your jet motor." My manuscript takes a whole chapter to describe the change that this caused in the craft, but I won't bother doing that. He said, "If you don't mind, Mr. Caldwell, we'll just disconnect your present jet motor and take one of your 60-foot crafts and I'll put this little motor in and I'll show you the lift power." They did that and they went straight up in the air. Now I know your people are going to say, "We have got a fool up here," but that's not so. I'm a journalist that likes the truth. I've talked to the people, and ladies and gentlemen, believers, I hope, I talked to Mr. Caldwell, the inventor. I don't care whom I could have met. I think I met the greatest man in the world. He was humble and kind and a bit mischievous and whimsical. He wanted to talk about everything about except what I wanted to talk about. He was not alone when I got him. He was accompanied by Secret Service personnel. That was fair enough. He went on and developed a craft that we have today, and at any time or any moment in the skies, we can put aloft 500 round-wing planes. I don't know how far we've gone because I stopped my conclusions in the 50s. I wonder what happened to the Hidden Valley. I wonder why the good people who developed the round-wing plane, where they disappeared to. I know the old ones retired, like me, although I wasn't one of them, like people of my age. And the flyers are walking the streets. There may be somebody in here today was part of it. But what happened to the Round-Wing Valley? I've tried to find out if they're still being built there. I've been on the site where crafts crashed into the ocean in Florida, but I couldn't prove where they were from, except I think they were alien. I'm wondering today if evil people have taken over some of the round-wing plane manufacturing facilities not far from here. Friends, it's a pleasure to be talking to you today. I want to tell you, thank you. I wondered who held the card. I've been looking all over. I'll tell you two great things that Caldwell did. In 1940, he took the craft, which was in pretty good shape then. Before it had the anti-gravity motor in, he flew north of Canada towards the North Pole. But there was no North Pole. There wasn't water. There wasn't land. There was a gaping hole. It began at the 85th parallel and went to the 90th and disappeared into a gaping hole into the, shall we say, the center of the Earth. Caldwell went back and he got into the polar archives and he found the accounts of Admiral Byrd, whom the government had made a fool of and really caused him to die of a heartbreak. In 1926, Admiral Byrd went up in a tri-motored plane. He found that the sun disappeared above him and a darkness was before him, and he saw a dim light below, and he didn't know what it was, and he got all flustered, and he came back. As he came back to the surface, his compass was corrected again, and he flew to Spitsbergen from where he'd started, and he came back and reported to United States that there was a phenomena he couldn't figure out. He went up the next year again in another plane, and he kept going. Honestly, ladies and gentlemen, he flew 1,200 miles with the wind in his back into the inside of this planet. Not a molten core, far from it. Continental shells bigger than on the surface, seas that were equal to ours, and he took 300 photographs and brought them back, and I tried to see them, and Franklin Birch, who was at the National Archives, would not let me in. Oh, I got in the cage, but I couldn't look at anything. Caldwell found those records and read them in 1940, and he took his round-wing plane in and went right through the Earth and came out at the South Pole in a 125-mile opening there. That's one thing he did. I told you that was 1940. That was a great accomplishment of the round-wing plane at that point. We hadn't had to fight a war. We hadn't had to do anything. 1952, I hesitate to tell you. I've had 3 attempts on my life, and I don't know if I'll walk away from this meeting if I say any more. I've had the needle, I've been poisoned, and I've had people sent to kill me. I don't care so much now, but I'd sure like to see my grandchildren grow up. And I'm pretty old. Got to be over 39. '52 with Prime Minister of Britain, who no longer was the Prime Minister. We all know he was Churchill. He's related to my mother's people. Mackenzie King, the Prime Minister of Canada, was present. And President Truman. They're all at Andrews Air Force Base as a 60-foot craft on 3 spindly legs took off and went into the sky to go and find if there was life in our solar system. Do you think I'm going to tell you any more? No. Well, I'll have a workshop, I guess we call it, and I may answer that question in detail because I've had someone read the diary, and I know exactly what happened when it left the Earth. I know exactly where our craft went when it went in the inner Earth. The man responsible for all this was Jonathan E. Caldwell, the greatest human being, who got his perspective, who got his imagination, who got his brains. I don't know from where, but it came at the time in our lives when we're moving into the next century, and we are the ones that are going to be part of this great transition. Praise the Lord. We got the power.
And I also wanted to tell you that John and Phil and I are going to do separate workshops this time. We did our workshop together in Florida, but each of us now are going to have separate 3-hour workshops. So I want to introduce Phil Sparks, who lives up in Mount Mitchell in North Carolina, and I've known he and his wife for many years. They're dear friends of mine. And I want to tell you that I can verify. I've seen the evidence of a lot of the strange stories that Phil is going to tell you, and I think that that you'll find him a very, very serious researcher. I certainly respect all his work. So, Mr. Phil.
All right, I'm going to kind of wing this. I am a real serious, like a quadruple Gemini, okay? So I talk in like this, you know. She's won it up already, okay? I want to welcome you all to Global Sciences, and I know that you're really special, and you guys definitely use your brain matter, and that's the reason I'm willing to do this, because my talk is quite a paradigm stretcher for even people like you, I think. But I've spent about 48 years in the Abe Lincoln Home Study course. And I graduated just recently, and that graduation was an EBS. It's not a PhD, but that EBS, I decided I would go ahead and start to spread some of this material that has taken me 48 years to gather. That's Enlightened Barbarian Scientist, by the way. So it's a little different, and I might be the only one. I know I'm going to get this started off. So the barbarians have got to lay down the swords, and I've carried one for years, and start doing a little something different. But anyhow, the paradigms are shifting, the consciousness and all that is going to switch just a little bit with this thing. I know that. I want to do something different. I want to welcome these 5 agents that we've got. They're really special because they're bound to have, I think they're probably bound to have asked for this job, because some little area of gray matter there is just asking for answers, you know? That's what I think. I could be wrong, but anyhow, I think we should welcome them. There's 5 of them, and if we can share kind of our information with them, we need to bring them up to speed all that we can. So anyhow, I've got a short time to do what's really a long subject, and I've got some overlays, and I'm going to run through them real quick. There'll be no time for questions. We can do that anytime during the conference. So, not yet. At any time of this 5 days, you guys ask me anything you want to ask me, and I'll sit down. We'll go in the hot tub. We'll go in the bathroom, wherever. We'll talk about anything. That's what I'm here for. That's what all the speakers are here for. So don't be aggravated when you can't get your questions in. Okay, we're going to start this. At about 6 years old, 6.5, 7 years old, I heard Admiral Byrd himself come over the radio. This was in 1956, and say, the present expedition has opened up a vast new land and will go down in the annals of human history as probably the greatest discovery of mankind. Well, I was only 6.5 or 7, but I thought there'd been a lot of talk about Admiral Byrd during the weeks previous to that, and I knew he was an explorer and he was world famous, and I thought, you know, I think I'm just going to be an explorer myself. I might even want to check out this vast new land. So, I don't know, I got sidetracked probably in some other things. It wasn't Army toys and things like that. I was more into turtles and snakes and alligators and all that. But at about 10 years old, I got back on it again in reading a book by Edgar Rice Burroughs, Tarzan at the Earth's Core. Edgar Rice Burroughs evidently was privy to some real interesting information, but his time was about the same time as Marshall B. Garner of the 20s, and I think evidently he had read the book or knew a little something about it. But once I read that story, that really hit it off. That really got me going. So at about 10 or 11 years old, I started researching as a kid what to me made perfect sense. I've always thought very differently, and in thinking very differently, my whole life has been paranormal events, one right after the other. And I think it's because of the way that I think. Well, I know it is now, but so I'm going to go ahead with this number 1. This is not really a talking about the inner earth for just a minute or two, but this is important. I think what happens here, power of thought. Has anybody ever really thought about that? You know, thought, where does that originate, see? I want to run through these fairly quick, but where does thought come from? We're told the brain. Now, I say we've got some problems with our thinking, obviously. But just sort of read through that with me. We're taught to think that. If you study the near-death experiences, though, and astral projections, astral travels, you start to question if these people are operating outside of the physical body, and they don't even know it usually for the most part, thinking might possibly come from outside the brain, the physical gray matter. Okay, is the brain then maybe only a receiver? Could it be like a multi-channel radio maybe? Maybe we receive only the signals that we're able to tune into. So if that's the case, then could thought perhaps equate to consciousness and then equate to frequency? So then if we learn to say, you know, work with thought, start playing with frequencies, clean up our, hey, cool, that's a big fly. I learned as a young kid that there's something going on. When I started thinking about things, when I started getting into material, things started happening to me that didn't happen to other people. I saw flying saucers when I was about 8 or 9 years old, several of them. I've had invisible but very loud, we'll call them entities, around me that have scared the devil out of my buddies and stuff. They don't bother me at all. But anyhow, I started thinking about this. I'm a thinker. I'm a professional thinker. Okay? Could our receivers be faulty, and could they have been tampered with, preventing us from receiving thoughts from the higher channels of pure unadulterated awareness, or say cosmic consciousness, the Akashic records, whatever you might want to say? So then if we could learn to control our thoughts, could we possibly put those thoughts in tune with cosmic consciousness? All right? Then I've worked on this some time. We're going to have to breeze through this, but there are astral planes, and a lot of this channeling that's going on, we're all channeling. You guys are all channeling information when you think. Some of this channeling, though, is coming from astral realms, and there's a bunch of guys jerking us around. You know, they're really jerking our chain. But most people are not discerning enough to recognize that they're being jerked around. All right, let's get on through this, but let's just end this with saying thoughts are frequencies, things. Dowsers prove that. I've been a dowser for quite a long time. I've had some remarkable things happening. Dowsing taught me a whole lot. That's something you're welcome to talk to me about anytime you want to. I'll teach you to dowse in 15 or 20 minutes, or if you're really slow, or 5 minutes. But let's say controlling these things, thoughts, and keeping the receiver tuned and the frequencies pure might possibly be the key to suddenly start opening up. Go ahead to the next one. Believe me, this is going to lead to the inner earth. But I'm saying we've been jerked around from day one, okay, by mind control that hasn't been spoke on yet. A mind control that is starting from the very earliest days and setting us up, very innocently setting us up, the boogeyman, Santa Claus, all this stuff, which turns out to be a lie. But anyhow, once you find out that you can be lied to, that there are lies, that thoughts aren't pure, things start happening in that brain, I say. You start shutting it down, for one. Kids are really remarkable until you start telling them what their limitations are. As soon as you start putting the limitations on them, they start becoming more like us, which is shut off. We're taught to put total faith in teachers, you know. Teachers are teaching us their perspective on things. I believe we should listen to a teacher, but we still should retain some discernment of our own, because now we're starting to learn that history is wrong. A lot of what the teachers have taught us is wrong. Medical science, all that stuff is wrong. A lot of this stuff is very polluted, skewed. I like that word. That's not, there's no R in there. We've been taught that doctors are the final word in matters of health and disease. We all know that that's a bunch of crap, okay? I've never been to a doctor in my entire life. I'm as strong as 3 men, and I'll prove it anytime you want me to. I've picked up cars. I mean, people are capable of just unbelievable things as soon as they release their limitations from their mind. Here is the biggie. I put the red mark on this because I can go off on this one, but I'm not going to. Religion is our biggest mind control device of all. It puts us in such a tiny little box, and it's got all these safety measures that have put in place to keep us there. And as you get a little older, you start, even if you questioned it when you were younger, you were able to do that because you knew you had a little time. As soon as you get a little older, these safety controls, this fear and stuff starts coming up in your mind, and you think, hey, I'm getting ready to cross that bridge. I might ought to just, start embracing some of this stuff. I've seen it my whole life. It happens. Well, I just won't go into that, but let's just say, could any and all of these be why only humans, no other animal? Talk to any of the researchers you want to talk to. Humans are the only animate objects that are using such a tiny part of their potential. It's estimated that even Einstein used that figure right there, and we pick him out as really something special. What would we be capable of if we started accessing more and more and more, maybe a cell at a time, but more and more and more of that gray matter? I say that very possibly. Oh, cool. It was too bright. All right.
And it's made mostly of cholesterol. Cutting down cholesterol.
Oh yeah. Okay. Well. The next one I want to talk about is some more of this stuff that we've been told, and this is mind control, but this goes back, some time ago. We're familiar with that one. Being a flat, of course, it has to be the center of the universe. We're standing here checking things out, and it's plain and simple to see. Everything revolves around us. We're the epitome. And the church is there to tell you so daily, Okay? We're talking about little more than 500 years ago, that if you didn't believe this, you guys know what happened, right? It was bad business. So, I mean, even the scientists that we're seeing from their research that, hey, there are some holes in this theory, rather than, be burned up, decided, okay, well, I'll just, maybe you all are right. Why am I so different? Like all us in here, we're different. We're like 1% of the population. Okay, some concepts have changed a little bit. They decided, that the astronomers proved that, planets appeared to be round, and the sun, sure enough, seemed to be the center of at least our universe. So, more powerful telescopes is that reason. If that didn't happen, I mean, we'd still be figuring things are flat, I guess. So we got the scientists to thank for, but I knock on them some anyhow. They're always, when their paradigm falls apart, the one that they preach to you for years and years and years, within a week they got a brand new one that's the new current the explanation. Now we're going to get into we're starting, believe it or not, to lead into this hollow earth thing. The earth gets hotter the deeper you go. We've been taught to think that, of course, and volcanoes would seem to prove that. The one I had the biggest trouble with, though, I mean, even as a kid, all right, I'm taught, even in school when we were taught, half the stuff we were taught was garbage, but even as a kid, I mean, how could a planet hurtling through space at so many 100 miles an hour have a molten iron core that hadn't eventually cooled? And why would the heaviest parts of the planet be in the center of the planet still? Why wouldn't they have gotten thrown to the outside? Even as a kid, that didn't make any sense to me. Well, now what I've brought, and I told Dean, I said, I'm going to bring you the people. It's one thing to tell them there's a hollow earth and talk about this and that, but if I could just find some physical evidence. I found enough for me years ago, but now I've got the new geophysical evidence that backs this up. We have an automatic light system here. It's time to change that one. I brought the geophysical stuff that's going to back me up, and I'm going to get to that if she'll just let me know when I have like 5 minutes. In 1949, they started finding discrepancies in the core mantle stuff. I mean, you know, the Earth was described as like a jawbreaker. There were very distinct layers. You had the crust, you had the mantle, and you had the core. And tremendous pressures, tremendous heat, all that stuff. But we started inventing some gizmos that could send some seismic waves, you know, show some of this stuff, and monitor volcanoes, monitor earthquakes, monitor a lot of unusual things. The biggest thing they were able to monitor that taught them the most, though, was our insistence upon playing with nuclear energy and hydrogen bombs and this sort of thing. Another thing I want to throw in that was real odd was they made the statement that the Earth had an unusual vibrational ring whenever something like that went off on the planet. How could a solid planet do that? How could it ring? So anyhow, because of what they found out, they had to move beyond this core mantle data and start thinking about these obvious variations that started showing up between the layers and the research on the core. So, Earth Magazine, I got to looking. Earth Magazine just backed me up so well. There was this seismologist, Thornley, very, very well thought of. He invented a lot of the equipment stuff from University of California. He found structures. That's why they had to do this. He found this in about 1973. And here is a direct quote from him now. What exists at the intersection of the core and the mantle may be a strange inverted landscape that in many ways resembles those at the surface. Ley discovered large, coherent, big word, coherent features, pretty much like continents. Now this was really blowing their theory all to pieces. One such slab under Alaska is 170 miles thick and some 950 miles across, or roughly the size of Saudi Arabia. Okay, this is still Earth Magazine. Beneath Alaska they find, and India, Siberia, and the Caribbean. Sharp structure, as if a layer of rock is floating at the boundary, floating on this molten core, okay? They still have the molten core, by the way, but at least they've backed me up with some structure. They found no such slabs under other sites. Very analogous. Here's another direct quote. Now, I've got the articles. They're going to be laying on my table. You're welcome to read this for yourself out of Scientific American and Earth Magazine. Very analogous to what we see at the surface of the Earth. China's still playing with their stuff, and by gosh, we've given them a bunch more here in the past few months, by the way. They're going to be playing with that back on us, I think. But in '92, they did an underground nuclear test, and the pulse, nice, strong pulse, enabled researchers who had all this seismic equipment set up to map out another big chunk. But here was another anomaly. This was not hot, this was not molten, this was a cold material. The seismic studies showed that, and this is obviously also a little more or less like an island. Under the tip of, northwest tip of Alaska. Okay, next one. So I was real tickled to find this stuff. I read everything in the world. I sleep like 2.5 hours a night. I've done it for 20 years. My eyes are sliding off my face, but I just can't sleep. I just, I think too much. Part of understanding how this boundary layer looks involves what it is made of. Yet the makeup of this jumbled layer at the base of the mantle continues to elude. Okay, their equipment showed that there was structure, but they still had to try to sort of fit this into the original paradigm. They created a device, because they're assuming that all this pressure is there. They created a device called a diamond anvil, which is more like a drill press coming together with 2 diamond points on it. It's really pretty small, but it's very strong. They used some real fine diamonds to do this with, but they started taking materials and observing that under this tremendous pressure that only diamond could stand, and they started doing this analogies, they thought, to what was going on in the center of the Earth. So then they built up all this new stuff. But I'm going to say, you know, this is presumed, okay? Let's hang on with this presumed, pressure and heat. The researchers now believe the core is not pure iron anymore, but is mixed with various elements. All right, they've changed the pure iron. Well, that's good. That's at least a start. I've read several books by the geophysicists. I find out they all have different versions, even though they do collaborate with each other, and they are willing to say that there are these continents and stuff, but we're past that, and these structures, but they have different versions of what's going on. They got to calling them anti-mountains and anti-valleys, meaning they were hanging down like stalactites, and they theorize that this molten core is splashing the peaks of these mountains. I don't know if anybody, I know some men in here have done some welding, but you cannot apply heat to rock, concrete block, dirt, or anything else without it blowing up in your face. The sharp structures that they're finding would not be able to contain themselves in a sharp structure if they were being splashed by molten iron on a daily basis. But anyhow, I'm just wanting to kind of show you what's going on. And like I say, I've got quite a few Scientific American articles here. Scientific American is a biggie and is very well thought of. Article on the Earth's mantle, seismic tomography. This is the type of seismic studies that they're, oh, I see my erasers show up under that, don't they? I wondered what those blobs were. These things, if you want to take notes on this sort of thing, you can look these up in any library or college, you know, and get a copy of this stuff. But here is another quote now. Let's go. On May of 1988, the core mantle region may be the most geologically active zone of the Earth. The physical changes across the interface between the core and the mantle are more pronounced. Now this is important. And the physical changes across the interface, the two layers that they're theorizing, are more pronounced than are those across the planetary surface separating air and rock. It's scientific jargon, and David Adair understands this stuff real well, I know. But you guys need to know that what they're saying is the mountains even are sharper than the Himalayas. They're more distinct. They're not rounded like mine at Grandfather Mountain. They're willing to admit that. Their seismic tomography is proving that, okay? That's very important. The main drawback, even though they're seeing these very distinct structures, but the main drawback, they all admit, is still the resolution smears out things that are less than 2,000 kilometers. Here's another quote. This is a good one. Here's some of them questioning, could large distinct structures exist at the bottom of the mantle just as continents mark the seismic heterogeneity of the Earth's surface? The inaccessibility of the regions has prevented geophysicists from understanding how such complicated structures came about. So they're back to their theories, but anyhow, we're about to get off of that and get on the good stuff now. Let's get back to Byrd. The first trip, John might have more information on Byrd than I do. There's a lot of information out there, but I have seen that people are playing with the information a little bit, but there's not really a lot of talk about what happened in 29. It seemed to be more of a contest, a flyover, just to see it. He was actually the first one to fly to the North Pole. On the second trip, he wrote this famous book, Alone. You may be familiar with that. He spent the whole year there by himself in a little base outside of Little America. He wasn't at Little America. He was at another smaller hut even than that by himself. Nearly died on that one. He was a fairly young man, but he nearly died on that from breathing carbon monoxide fumes from his wood stove. But the third trip now, it starts to get a little bit more interesting. He mapped the whole coast. He mapped over 100,000 square miles of the land. And there were a few anomalies that he made note of in regards to the land. There began to be problems there because in this mapping process, cartographers saw that they couldn't incorporate all the land that they had come up with into the region. They couldn't put it on the globe, it didn't fit. That's when they started coming up with this depression that's at the polar regions where it's more like an apple than a basketball. Okay, the fourth trip is pretty significant. As a commander of a naval expedition, He penetrated now this is a quote from Byrd, 1,700 miles he penetrated beyond the pole and reported an iceless territory, never reported before and recorded on the map, of mountains. Now this is 1,300 miles, I think it is, above the tree line, by the way, 1,300 miles, and he's went 1,700 miles beyond the pole. Beyond the pole should have put him across the continent of Antarctica and into a known land. But in this expedition, he saw mountains, forest, green vegetation, lakes and rivers, and in the underbrush he reported seeing a strange animal that resembled a mammoth. He actually turned the plane and made 2 flyovers on this creature here and says, yes, it looks more like a woolly mammoth than it does an elephant. Now this stuff was reported, these anomalies, the isolate territory was reported by radio. All right, the 5th trip. This is the one that I heard when I was about 6.5, 7 years old, to the Antarctic. And right before he left now, he said in a newspaper and a radio interview that I would like to see that land beyond the pole. This could be, he said, the land beyond the pole is the center of the great unknown. Now this is great. This is a real important statement, I think. I've got a book that was written 6 years after this. Byrd died shortly when he come back off of this one. Byrd died in, I think, December of 57?
56, I think. About that time.
Shortly after he came back, he looked great when he came back, but for some reason he died. I'm suspicious of that one, but I'm a conspiracy, nut anyhow. When he came back, this is what I heard. The present expedition has opened up a vast new land. This could be the most important expedition in the history of the world. This was confirmed now by press and radio. And shortly before his death, he was still talking this stuff, and that's why I'm suspicious about this. He wouldn't shut up about it. He was still talking about this enchanted continent in the sky, land of everlasting mystery. Next one. Died in a military hospital. Preceding his death and up to that point, he stuck by his previous statements of 47, 56, and 57. This is where he started naming these anomalies that just wouldn't go away. How could someone of his status, and he was very educated too, and by the way, he was like one of the best navigators on the planet. You can't say, like they've tried to do, that the man was lost. I mean, he knew exactly what he was doing. Why would he make such a statement if it wasn't true? And if it was true, why were the regions largely ignored, discounted, and ridiculed? But what is real interesting, I mean, like the same year, 13 nations took a very unusual interest in Antarctica in particular, the Arctic also, but especially Antarctica. They all started staking claim to it. And I've got maps of that shows all the little pie slices that we all took previous to that. So I mean, this is a really nasty place. Nobody wanted it. It's huge, but nobody wanted it. The whole continent was unclaimed. It was just there, and everybody knew it was there. Byrd, by the way, I'm just going to throw in, had a real interesting idea, and it's still a great one. He thought the world should use the Antarctica as a freezer to store food, because we produce large amounts of surplus food. But the problem is in storage and bugs and all this and that, and it goes bad. That's a great idea. Why has not that been done? Some of these polar researchers actually ate food that was left by previous expeditions 50 years previous to that. Even bread. It was just fine. Okay, anyhow, this same time now, after this mad rush, in 57 and 58, all these bases had been laid claim to, and an international treaty or agreement was signed in 59 by representatives of 12 governments. I've got the treaty in a book written 1 year after it was enacted. But very suspicious provisions. What they did was forbid any kind of nuclear testing. This was at the peak of all this stuff, and this is a frozen wasteland. Why would they do that? Why would they, they're willing to do it on their own their own territory, but not out here at this frozen wasteland with supposedly nothing but icebergs, snow, hundreds of miles of nothing, and all that at well below 0 temperatures. Why would they have such a treaty there? That's interesting to me. Okay, Ray Palmer got on this thing and spent a lot of time on it. I've got a cover copy of his magazine. I don't have the magazine, it's very rare. Had some real problems with this. This is when the Men in Black showed up, if you're all familiar with them. These are not government people, by the way. I know where the Men in Black come from. They don't come from the surface. They're not any of the members of these 5 that are here. Some very unusual things began to take place. No magazines were found in the delivery truck. This man had paid for 5,000, I think it was, magazines, and the printer couldn't find a shipping receipt. But he had a receipt, Palmer had a receipt proving he had paid for it, so he demanded a reprint, and then the printer couldn't find the plates. He got really hateful with the printer, and they finally found the plates, but they had been banged up and destroyed. Okay, one distributor, so the story goes, that for some reason had some of these original copies that were evidently taken out of the truck because this was a large order. 750 copies were delivered to this little newsstand. The distributor and the copies ended up disappeared, never showed up again. Okay, next one. Now I'm going to run through these anomalies real quick because we got 5 minutes and I know we're going to run out of time, but just kind of read these things, you know, and make a note. You can't unfortunately see, that's page 7, but make a note of any of these things and I'll talk with you about it at length at any time. But this is anomalies that I've worked on for years. I've read almost all of the Arctic travelers, and I'm talking beyond Bert. I'm talking Norwegians and Icelanders and, you know, just people from all over the planet. They all have these anomalies, these polar explorers they come up with. Icebergs are composed of fresh water is real interesting because the ones in the Arctic are 450, there's one that's 450 miles long of solid ice. Unusual colored snow, miles of it, an increase in animal life the further you go. Amount of land discovered can't be placed in the presumed continental area. The Army and the Navy had a big feud going for years because the Army called the Navy incompetent, the Navy called the Army incompetent because they all had found these things. And then they would go back and couldn't find them again. Well, it's their navigation that's a problem, but we'll have to go in at it another time. And no, we do not cross the pole and fly over it every day. They think that they do, but the way that we navigate makes it impossible for them to do that, so that's important to slip in here. The pole located at many different points, thousands, this is a biggie, and I've got a lot of stuff on this too. Thousands of mammoth remains in Siberia, some of them with buttercups, little pine cones, the tips of fir trees still in their mouth and their stomach, the meat very edible. Butterflies, bees, and mosquitoes. Mosquitoes pestered these guys at the North Pole. I mean, we're talking a long, long way away. Bird flew beyond it. South Pole, he claimed he flew 23 miles beyond that. Strange tidal waves in the Arctic. You know, I've got answers for this stuff, but this is just anomalies. Fresh water, several feet in the Arctic Ocean. There are places where some of the explorers were able to get fresh water in the ocean. This is exploring by boat. For several feet deep, it was just water, clear water. When they went below that, it was salt. I liked this one. Some have observed a small, smoky sun with a reddish appearance. And Nansen had to turn back because of dust. Dust so bad he couldn't even breathe. Naked Eskimos have been seen coming out of the north. When you ask them where they come from, they point north. And they, you know, the early Eskimos, the early Inuits, drew pictures of animals that they should have never seen in their entire existence. And they also said they came from a land that was warm and they drew trees and all these things, you know, all these anomalies. Of course, now we have, educated these Eskimos. They don't know anything about their culture because religion got to them, wiped them out like we've done everything else. But this mock sun is real interesting. I've got a scrimshaw. I've got a picture of this strange sun that's been described. This out of a book, but I've got a scrimshaw that to me, it's one of those weird things that happened to me while I was doing this research. I found something I pulled out of a Reader's Digest in 1960. I mean, I was a kid on the frozen mammoths when I was doing this research. I just found it again about 3 months ago, and the next day I bought a piece of scrimshaw that's got mastodons. I've got 1 minute, so we're going to close this quick. Mastodons on it with this unusual sun and trees. This sun with these rays, but I have a fairly large picture. It'll be back there on our table. Let's see if we can get them a picture of the, I think, just go on through that. There's a picture there somewhere. And we'll talk about that anytime you want to. But this picture, this is actually a reproduction out of Marshall B. Garner's book, but I colored this thing up. But I drew this picture. I read Marshall B. Garner's book, parts of it, about 2 years ago. I knew about the book, but I'd never read it. It was rare. And I drew this on a napkin for my mother, something that looked very similar to this back in 1974. It's just what my research made me think. Now the mileage, forget that. That's not right, and neither is that right, and neither is this right. In places it is, but there's big differentiations. But this is more or less what this planet looks like and what all the planets look like. And unfortunately, this talk is coming to a close. There's just not enough time, but I do have tons of information on this. I'm going to do a workshop. If you, yeah, I want to show this map that John, this map is John's, and the camera will have to pan this thing, but okay. This is supposedly done by an intraterrestrial. It won't go through there, John. It's not clear. It's not going to show up very good there. So we'll lay that on my table over there too, where you can see that. This was drawn by, the man has been killed, John tells me, but this is drawn by someone who lives there. So I think it'll be quite, yeah, that's great. That's great. Man just pulled this out of his hat here. I've got this in a smaller version, but this is a NASA photograph. I think this was back in the 70s, wasn't it?
Yeah, satellite picture.
Okay. They, of course, disclaim it, but see, the poles and the spinning vortex that's created at both polar openings create a tremendous cloud cover that is always there. I mean, 99.9999999% of the time, it's always going to be there. For some reason, it wasn't right now. And they've disclaimed this photograph, but it does show up. And there's lots of books on this stuff, too, by the way. I've probably got a dozen or 15 myself, so we can talk about that. I've got a bibliography that I can share with you also. Thanks. Great. But I've worked on this most of my life. I have a mission to go. I know several ways to go, and I'm going to do it. It's my mission. And hey, they can take me out. I don't care. We'll wrestle in the back of the parking lot, whatever they want to do. I have no fear. I have personally touched a Bigfoot. I jumped on a Bigfoot. I grabbed a Bigfoot. I have no fear, But anyhow, this thing has ended, I'm afraid. And we'll just hit me up for questions anytime you can think of. Thanks for that photo. Well, that's okay.